The Colorado mountains stood silent and unforgiving as Caleb Stone counted out $50 in gold coins, more money than he'd spent on himself in 5 years. The trading post owner raised an eyebrow at the unusual transaction. Caleb had a reputation throughout these mountains as the man who needed no one, a trapper whose cabin sat so far into the wilderness that most folks forgot he existed. But winter was coming hard and fast, and at 42, Caleb's body was finally admitting what his pride had long denied. He needed help. "I need someone to cook and keep house through winter," Caleb said gruffly. "Heard there's a widow in town, pregnant and desperate. Tell her room, board, and $50 if she can handle mountain living till spring." Pete nodded slowly, knowing exactly who Caleb meant. Mary Catherine Walsh had arrived 3 months ago, 7 months pregnant and newly widowed after her husband died in a mining accident. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a quiet dignity that kept her from begging. What Pete did not tell Caleb was that Mary Catherine was educated and came from a good family back east. Before we continue this powerful story, if you believe that sometimes the people we least expect can change our lives forever, hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring Wild West stories. 2 weeks later, Caleb returned to town to collect his new employee. He expected a hardened frontier woman. What he found was a slender young woman of perhaps 25, with auburn hair, intelligent gray eyes, and a belly swollen with child. She stood outside the trading post with a single worn carpet bag, her back straight, despite obvious exhaustion. "You're the widow Walsh?" he asked roughly. "I am Mary Catherine Walsh," she replied softly. "And you must be Mr. Stone. I'm grateful for this opportunity." The journey to Caleb's cabin took 3 days. Mary Catherine never complained, but he could see the toll the rough travel took on her. She rode the mule with quiet determination, her face pale but composed. At night, she insisted on helping set up camp despite his gruff orders to rest. Caleb found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, troubled by the protectiveness rising in his chest. The cabin was exactly what Mary Catherine expected, rough and built for survival, not comfort. One room with a stone fireplace, a table, a bed in the corner, and shelves holding supplies. "You'll take the bed," Caleb announced, already gathering blankets to make himself a pallet near the fire. "I won't hear argument." Mary Catherine simply nodded, and for the first time since her husband died, she felt something close to safe. The first weeks were an awkward dance of two solitary souls learning to share space. Caleb would grunt orders and disappear for hours to check his trap lines, returning to find Mary Catherine had transformed his cabin into something resembling a home. She cooked simple but nourishing meals, organized his supplies, and quietly mended his worn clothes. But it was the small things that unsettled him. The way she'd placed wildflowers in a tin cup on the table, how she hummed softly while working, filling the silence with something that sounded like hope. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Caleb returned to find Mary Catherine reading by firelight, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "Didn't know you could read," he said. She looked up with a gentle smile. "I was a teacher back in Philadelphia. I fell in love with a man my family deemed unsuitable. We came west to build a life together." Her voice caught. "He died 2 months after we arrived. I had nothing left, no money for passage home, and too much pride to beg my family for help." "What are you reading?" he asked, sitting down. Mary Catherine held up the worn book. "Poetry, Whitman. Would you like me to read to you?" Caleb almost refused. He'd never learned to read properly, and the shame of it had followed him his whole life. But something in her eyes, a lack of judgment, made him nod. That night, Mary Catherine's soft voice filled the cabin with words about nature and connection. Caleb sat motionless, feeling something frozen inside him begin to thaw. The routine became their shared language. Caleb would work his trap lines, and Mary Catherine would keep the cabin warm. But gradually, they began to talk. She told him about her childhood and dreams of opening a school. He found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about growing up rough, about a father who beat learning into him with fists, about retreating to these mountains to escape a world that made him feel small. Mary Catherine listened without pity, only understanding. and slowly Caleb began to see himself differently, not as a failure, but as a survivor. If this story is touching your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that grace can heal the deepest wounds. As winter deepened and Mary Catherine's pregnancy advanced, Caleb prepared for the birth with a fear he'd never experienced. He rode to town through dangerous snow to fetch the midwife. When Mary Catherine's labor began on a bitter January night, Caleb paced outside in the freezing dark. The baby's first cry split the night like a miracle, and when the midwife called him inside, he found Mary Catherine exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny daughter with red hair. "Her name is Grace," Mary Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Because that's what you've shown me. Grace in giving me shelter. Grace in treating me with respect. Grace in seeing my worth when I'd forgotten it myself." Caleb felt his own eyes burning. "You named her wrong," he said roughly, his voice breaking. "You're the one who brought Grace here. You took a man who'd forgotten how to be human and reminded him what it means to live, not just survive." Spring came slowly, and with it, a reckoning. The $50 sat untouched, and both knew that winter's end meant decision time. One morning, as Grace cooed in her mother's arms, Caleb cleared his throat. "I know you probably want to go back to civilization." Mary Catherine looked at him steadily. "What do you want, Caleb?" He struggled with the words. "I want you to stay, both of you. Not as my employee, but as my family. I'm not educated or refined, and I know I'm too old and rough. But I love you, Mary Catherine. You and Grace taught me that it's never too late to change." Mary Catherine set Grace in her cradle and took his weathered hands in hers. "You think you're rough and uneducated, but you're the kindest, most honorable man I've ever known. You gave me shelter when I had none, respect when the world had discarded me. You think I taught you grace, but Caleb, you've been showing me grace since the moment we met. I saw it for what it was, love growing quietly between us." They married that spring in the small church in town, with Grace sleeping peacefully through the ceremony. Together they transformed Caleb's cabin into a real home. She taught him to read by lamplight, patient where the world had been cruel. He built her a schoolroom, and soon children from scattered mountain families came for lessons, grateful for the education and the example of two people who'd found redemption in each other. Years later, when people asked Caleb about his transformation, he'd say the same thing. "I thought I was hiring someone to cook and clean. Instead, I got someone who taught me that grace isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to see the good in people, including yourself." Mary Catherine looked at a bitter, lonely man and saw someone worth saving. That kind of grace changes everything. This story reminds us that sometimes our greatest transformations come from allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, to let someone see us as we truly are. Caleb learned that true courage isn't about isolation, it's about opening your heart. Mary Catherine showed us that grace is freely offered to anyone willing to receive it, and in giving grace to others, we often find our own redemption. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to change. Leave a comment about a time someone showed you unexpected grace. Subscribe because every week we bring you more stories of transformation from the Wild West. Remember, like Caleb and Mary Catherine proved, the people who change our lives often arrive when we least expect them. Until next time, may you have the courage to both give and receive grace.